Why does Trump want Greenland? First, if he makes a move on Greenland, would it trigger NATO's Article 5? Secondly, how would the EU respond? Karthik says, what's Trump's real intent behind his threats to take over Greenland? He keeps mentioning it's for national security. Yes, it does, right? To cover against Chinese and Russian expansionism. But the US also already has an army base in Greenland. Why aren't they trying to go their conventional route of not of having more bases in the country and vassalizing the country? Right, right, right. So what does Trump want? Why does he want Greenland? So to see, let's go to the map and let's understand where Greenland is located and what's the strategic importance of Greenland. Let's put the map on the screen and navigate to that part of the world. So we are talking about, we go west, west, west from India, west, 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 and then we are in the Arctic Ocean. And this here is Greenland. It looks gigantic from here. It's not that big. It's because of the projection, the way things are projected. Okay. And Greenland belongs to Denmark. Denmark, this little country over here. Yeah. Denmark. Um, whose capital is Copenhagen. So Denmark somehow owns Greenland. Okay, how did it end up owning Greenland? That's a whole different story. We'll not go there. Now, if you look at it from this perspective, Greenland sits between the northern Russian region and North America. And if the Russians were to potentially, let's say, launch ballistic missiles at the US, if you have early warning stations, etc., in Greenland, then you can very quickly uh, detect such launches and send a warning back to the United States. And Greenland, obviously, it's a large region, and it has substantial deposits of oil and gas. It also has substantial deposits of other resources, other minerals, and so on. So it's pretty valuable. The United States wants to acquire completely sovereign. It wants sovereign capture over large territories that are rich in resources. In the case of Venezuela, there's a whole population that lives there. So you can't acquire it in the fact in the sense of having sovereign control over Venezuela. So you vassalize Venezuela. When it comes to Iran, you can vassalize Iran because you have a big population there. You can't put boats on the ground. But Greenland is mainly empty. What's the population of Greenland? Let's quickly take a look at that. Maybe a couple thousand people, maybe 10,000. I don't know. Let's see. What's the population of Greenland? Population of Greenland. What's the population? 56 to 57,000 people. Give each of them $1 million. Done deal. They will all vote to become US citizens. And so, because it's got such a small population, it's a huge territory, it makes sense for the US to just take it over, just gobble it up. And what can Denmark do? Nothing. What are they going to do? Send some soldiers? Come on. That's not going to work. The Americans already have this fuel base or whatever it is, but they want to acquire the entire territory and use it for a variety of purposes. They may put up more military bases, they may set up mining operations, and so on. The Americans want to take formal sovereign control of as many resources as possible. There's also the Russian angle, like I said, the Chinese angle also. The Chinese may have interests in the region. The Russians and Chinese, as we know, are cooperating. So that's the thing. So Trump wants Greenland, and it's most likely going to happen sooner or later. So that's why Greenland is something that Trump desires. It makes sense from a material perspective, from a security strategic perspective, from the perspective of the location, geographical location of the place, from the perspective of it having oil and gas, minerals, and other resources. Yeah. So now the question is, if the Americans take Greenland, will it trigger NATO's Article 5? See, Denmark, which owns Greenland, is a member of NATO. The US is the owner of NATO and a member of NATO. And you have a bunch of other countries that are members of NATO. The deal is, NATO's Article 5 says that if any of the member states of NATO comes under attack, it's to be treated as an attack on everybody else, and everybody is supposed to come to the defense of the nation that's a member of NATO that's been attacked. But that Article 5, it talks about external attack from a non NATO member. But what if a NATO member attacks a NATO member? What happens then? And that NATO member is the US, the overlord, the supreme hegemon, the owner of NATO. What happens? There's nothing NATO nations can do about this. This will most likely lead to NATO ceasing to exist as a functioning bloc, as a functioning alliance. It may fragment NATO, it may destroy NATO entirely. NATO may no longer operate after this. Other nations may perhaps potentially withdraw from NATO. And the US, maybe that's what the US wants. Maybe the US wants to deal with every nation one to one instead of dealing with a bunch of nations together. It actually makes sense if you're really powerful to not have these big loose alliances or whatever. Deal with each nation one to one, vassalize each nation one to one, put your armed forces on each nation one on one. That way you have better, more rigorous, more granular control than going through the NATO bureaucracy and all that. Maybe it makes sense. So maybe the Americans have decided it's time to end NATO, and maybe Greenland, a move on Greenland could be the trigger that ends NATO. How will the EU respond? So the EU is not NATO; it's a different thing, right? The EU is this bureaucratic bloc based out of Brussels. What will the EU do? How could or would the EU respond? Well, the EU will issue protests. The EU will issue strong statements. The EU may do some strong diplomacy. The EU may decide to impose sanctions on the US. That sort of thing. Yeah. I don't think the EU will dare impose sanctions on the US, because the bureaucrats who run the EU, they can be very badly, brutally sanctioned by the Americans, and that will make their lives miserable. So I don't think there's much the EU can do about this. So maybe the US has decided it's time to end NATO. We will deal with all of these European nations one to one, one on one. We will manage them individually instead of managing them as a coalition. That gives the US way more control over each individual nation. So you can recreate the EU, the NATO-like circumstances individually with each nation, and make it even more rigorous, right? So maybe that's what the US wants. So looks like Greenland could happen soon. Greenland, there's no urgency there. The Americans can wait maybe until Iran is done or something. So you're going to see a lot of changes maybe in this year, 2026.